and welcome back to Compassion and Company. I'm your host, Jen Miles, and today I'm here with my friend Sam. She is a practicing social worker, and I met her through just the same work field. We worked at the same agency last summer. So Sam, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm currently working as a case manager for a law firm in downtown Vancouver. My job basically is to work as an intake coordinator for any women who are in need of legal assistance, who aren't eligible for legal aid but who still can't afford a lawyer. There's a really big gap in financial eligibility that our law firm works to close. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing now, but I have a lot of experience as a youth worker with Indigenous youth who are vulnerable to impacts of colonialism and all those kinds of things. So yeah, that's me.
Hard work.
I'm also a master's student at UVic.
Yes.
So still going through that.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right, so Sam, today I want to start off by asking you, what is your understanding of self-compassion?
So I actually had never thought about self-compassion and how it applies to me until you asked me, I don't even know, it was 2 months ago now, and you were like, what do you do to practice self-compassion? I had to sit there for a bit, and I was like, I don't know, and the first thing that kind of came to mind was that cliche self-care thing of bubble bath, a face mask, and going for a run or exercise or whatever. But then you kind of were like, hey, what else? And I was like, I don't know, to take that deeper, I guess you start thinking about the work you do every day, and the work I do is pretty heavily emotional. A lot of the things that I'm dealing with while it's on the phone, I'm hearing a lot of really challenging stuff, and so and with working with youth and stuff, really intense situations that we'll be in. So I think a really big thing has been setting boundaries, and we can kind of dive into that a bit more, I think, but that's definitely a really big thing to kind of protect my mental health without having to compartmentalize kind of stuff, because then sometimes when you kind of close something up in a box and put it in the back of your mind, it can manifest later. So I think that kind of addressing that as boundary setting is a really big way, in addition to the face mask and the bubble bath and the glass of wine at the end of the day kind of thing. So
do you want to expand a little more on your work and kind of how that relates to how you're practicing self-compassion now on a daily basis?
Yeah. So I guess what I kind of do is I essentially triage cases. So at the legal clinic that I work at, it's run by law students, and the idea is that we can't provide full legal representation, which is ultimately the goal if you have a legal matter, especially in family law. So basically my job is to help people apply the legal aid, because it can be a really frustrating and unfair process. And it really is not meant to serve women, especially women fleeing abuse, which is our primary group of women that are coming to us. And so I think I spend a lot of time, I'm that first point of contact. I'm often the first person that they've talked to about their situation. So it's not just, hi, this is what I need. It's, hi, these are all the horrible things that have happened to me.
Interesting. Do you think the act of witnessing is a way you're showing self-compassion while at work? Or how does that impact your self-compassion?
Right. So, yeah, I guess thinking about it, it kind of does, because I'm not just sitting there listening passively, waiting for that key thing that I need to hear. I'm also reminding women I'm so proud of you for what you're doing. This is incredible that you found a resource that can help you when there's so few of them out there. Our organization is the only one in BC that does anything like this.
Wow. So,
and there's a huge gap. We serve at least 700 women a year, and it's only been open for 4 years. So it's incredible. And I think that witnessing piece, it keeps me active and not just sitting there sort of thinking about how angry I am at the person that's doing this to this other person I'm talking to. And that's something we can maybe dive into a little later about holding the dignity of everybody in a situation, and not just wanting to holding that anger, because that's another thing that I'm really feeling. So that witnessing piece is really great, because it's also like validating that experience of that woman and holding that space for her, but not doing something that's out of the scope of what I'm able to do.
Mm-hmm. So how do you go home with that, and how do you then show yourself that self-compassion? Because already what I'm hearing is that you show a lot of compassion all day long, and a lot of energy going into other people. So when do you get to take back that energy?
Yeah, so I guess I've actually been practicing this thing because I've been having to work from home. It's not like I get that 30-minute drive home from work, or like that commute home on the bus, you know, to like kind of decompress, which I really counted on at my old job as a youth worker, where I had that opportunity to like not have to talk to anyone for that period of time of like getting home. So now I've actually been practicing, and it's actually advice from my therapist, to schedule out, because I end at 5, and schedule out 10 minutes at least where it's just like completely purely my time, whether it's like I'm really angry, so I do like something like jumping jacks or like whatever it is, to just like separate myself from that day that I've had and then move into the next chapter of the day.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's actually been super helpful. Sometimes I'll take a shower, or I'll go for a quick run, maybe a walk outside. Sometimes I'll read a book, like just something to like separate me, but it's 10 minutes where it's like just me getting over what the day was, kind of thing. So I'm not carrying it with me for the rest of the night.
How do you understand self-compassion as a white, cisgender female?
Yeah, so I guess I've been brought up in a very, very privileged family in a privileged neighborhood. Calling the police was a point of safety for me. It was never something I questioned. I don't have to worry about walking around in my neighborhood, things like that. And that's completely shaped everything that how I view, how I take care of myself, how I take care of others. I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that like it's been sort of ingrained in me, like in terms of how society views it, but also in terms of like how my family views it. Like it's like, oh, a shopping spree can like just make you feel better, and like retail therapy will make you feel better, and like I was taboo for me to go to therapy. Like my mom was like, is something wrong with you? Like, why are you going? Kind of thing. And she was almost embarrassed when I told her that was something I started doing in my undergrad, and like to kind of deal with like the stress and stuff. Yeah.
That would have been hard on you.
Yeah, it wasn't the best for sure.
How'd that make you feel?
Yeah, just like the classic stereotypes around mental health. It was like there has to be something wrong with you if you're getting help, and that it's bad if there's quote unquote something wrong with you, which is not something I see as true at all. But yeah, it's kind of how I was conditioned to feel, and I was embarrassed even to tell people that I was going, and it was like, didn't want to tell people what appointment I was going to. It was like better to say I was going to the doctor than to go to therapy, kind of thing. But I definitely do not hide it now. Like I will talk about it on a podcast, and I don't care. So
here we are broadcasting it to everybody.
Normalize it, right?
Is there a way you show self-compassion that comes from within, and rather than external experiences? Is there something you do or say to yourself that gives yourself that sense of self-compassion?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that a big thing is like, as you know, like I put a lot of pressure on myself, like whether it's like something to do with school or like work, or how I'm doing in terms of even just like maintaining friendships, you know, like a lot of pressure with that. So I think a lot of it's like reminding myself to slow down, and that I often feel like things are really big when they're not. And so a big thing that I've been doing is even just like breathing, like super simple, like doing like a body scan breathing kind of thing, exercise like that. That's been super, super helpful. But another thing has been really listening to my body, which has been a really hard thing to do. Like that pressure to like always do a really hard workout, and like, oh, I can only calm down if I like get my anger out through a run or like through a HIIT workout or something. Whereas I'm realizing that like some days like my body does need to slow down and do a really slow yoga practice, or just like kind of stretch for the evening or something, or just a walk, which like is really hard to sort of challenge that idea in my head of like I have to work extra hard to feel better, or like I can turn it down and slow down and take it easy, you know, and rest. Yeah.
Where do you think that idea in your head that you have to push yourself, where does that come from?
I think I've always wanted to impress my parents and my family and like live up to all the expectations I kind of put on myself. I think a lot of it's ingrained in me from where I did my undergrad at the University of Toronto, where there's a lot of pressure to be the best and like to have that 4.0 GPA, and I think I really absorbed, like I really take on the things that are sort of like put on me and like expressed around me. I really take up my environment, and I think that had a serious lasting impression. And that's actually been a really great thing about being at UVic is the environment is so different. Like it's not like cutthroat in any way. It's very much like, okay, we're in this all together. We're doing this at our own pace. If you need an extra few days, it's not a big deal kind of thing, especially in our classes. And like as a cohort, there's 13 of us, and it's much more of a team effort to get through the semester together as opposed to like who's going to be on top kind of thing. So that's definitely been a factor in that for sure. Yeah. And I'm feeling that shift, right? Like I'm feeling that shift from like where I was 2 years ago versus now, and like how much easier I am on myself. And I think that's a really big piece of self-compassion as well.
Something I want to ask you. Do you identify as an empath?
I think so. Yeah, the more that you and I have like sort of talked about that, for sure, has been something that it is something I'd identify with. Like I really I feel like I almost like wear other people's emotions on my sleeve sometimes, you know, like I can be on the phone listening to a woman disclose her story, and like I can tear up because like I'm just like feeling, and like obviously I can't embody that pain that she's experiencing or take that as my own, but like I can feel it. And I do that a lot with friends and with family, and so sometimes I feel like I'm not just carrying my own stuff, but like
you're having to like unpack all that too. Like that's a lot. Yeah. So how do you decompress from all those things, like other people's energies as well as your own, and like their emotions, as you put it?
Yeah, it definitely comes back to boundaries. Like that's a really big thing that I've been learning about. Another thing is that I'm learning I can't control other people. I can't control the decisions they make. And I think that's something that used to be really hard, especially working with youth, because all I wanted to do was make sure that they were safe. But like I can't tell them what to do. I can't stop them. They have their own autonomy, and that's something that they deserve. And I'm not in charge of keeping them safe. I'm there to give them the opportunity. But if ultimately it's their choice, and I have to respect that. And I think that goes along with so many things, like in terms of friends, and whether it's someone in a bad relationship to like some sort of really risky situation otherwise.
Familiar relations.
Yeah.
Do you think self-compassion is taboo? And if so, or if not, why?
I think there's kind of like this fine line between, I guess maybe we can unpack this a little bit more too, is that difference between self-compassion and self-care, and like and how that looks, because I think self-care has become this like capitalist like method of I don't even know, but like, you know, like
it's like
so
the consumerism part of it.
Exactly.
It's the idea that we need to consume
to feel better.
Order to have that self-validation, and that I am calm now, I'm okay because I consume this thing. I consume tea, I have a drink at the end of the day, I, you know, treat myself to some food, that kind of, you know, pop culture mentality.
Or like the face mask, you know, like, oh, I do a face mask and suddenly I'm like healed of anything I dealt with today, you know.
And it's, like you said, it's more than that. It's the boundary setting, it's a lot of different things.
For sure. I think to answer your question about if it's taboo, I think it's something that we don't really talk about. Like now there's more of a narrative around what self-care looks like, and like we just said, it's very like much based on like the things that we consume and how we do material things to make us feel better, look better, whatever it is. And I think that until that day you asked me, like, how do you practice self-compassion? It was like, wow, I don't know. So I think that's an interesting
sign.
Yeah. It speaks volumes about how we view self-compassion and how we, I guess, practice it.
Do you want to dive in a little more with that?
Yeah, I guess, like, it's hard to talk about feelings. It's hard to open up about those things. And a lot of the stuff we do in terms of self-compassion, at least for me, it's like someone might laugh and be like, oh, right, haha, you do yoga, or like, oh, you do breath work, or like, oh, you meditate. Like, I have so many friends who just be like, I'm not meditating, that's stupid. Where I'm like, it can literally save me from a panic attack sometimes, or like having a meltdown, or like that ability to like reground myself. And I think the conversation's definitely opening up more now, especially as like self-care is being spoken about more and people are breaking down that notion that self-care equals consuming something. And I think that maybe will come with time. Lots of changes are happening anyway, so maybe that will be part of it. I don't know, but yeah.
Do you find now that, are you still going to that consumption within self-compassion? Like, is that still a component for you? Or are you more focused on that, like, introspective work as well as yoga and, like, those other things?
Interestingly enough, I think that the shift really came when the pandemic started. Because, like, for me before, it was, like, I was constantly, like, 14 hours a day. I was, like, go, 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 go. Like, I never stopped. Like, I'd schedule in a yoga class, but then have to run from the yoga class somewhere else. And so it was never, like, really ever slowing down. And I know I'm so privileged to be able to say, like, yeah, the pandemic gave me the opportunity to have that self-reflection and that time to slow down, when I know for many people that's not the case. But I think that I spent a lot of time alone in an apartment in Victoria before moving back, so that really showed me that there's so many things I don't need that I do. Right? Like, I don't have to go and spend a ton of money on a passive yoga studio. I don't have to go and, like, shop in a store to make me feel better, you know? Like, buying a new outfit doesn't fix how I'm feeling, you know? It's not like instant gratification, but, like, it's not long lasting. So I think that's been something I've been really realizing and practicing, is like that slowing down piece, and it's okay to slow down. Like, it's not, you're not lazy or you're not unproductive to slow down. In fact, like, I'm more productive now that I take days of rest, and I'm not doing something wrong because I'm letting myself sleep more, or because I'm letting myself just kind of chill and not have to be, like, constantly scheduled to a T every day kind of thing. So
yeah. Where does that, like, productivity mentality come from, like, for you? Like, because you kind of mentioned that.
Yeah. I think, like, all through high school, I was dancing competitively and doing other sports on top of that. So I was always, like, fully scheduled. Like, I left school at 3 and I either went straight to dance class and then straight to field hockey practice. And, like, like, my nights didn't end till, like, 9 most of the time.
Oh, wow.
And then, like, that's when I did homework and ate dinner kind of thing. So, like, I guess even back then it was, like, super, like, everything. I always had something I was doing, and, like, I had to do things super productively to get it done. And then in undergrad, I joined everything I could possibly join, but, like, still tried to balance having fun and exercising and everything and doing schoolwork and then exceeding and excelling at the schoolwork. So I think that it's just kind of been ingrained in me by my environment and by sort of, like, that idea that if I'm not constantly doing things, then I'm doing something wrong. And then I think a lot of that pressure even, like, comes from myself, where I'm like, if I'm not constantly busy, I'm doing something I should be doing something more, you know? But yeah, especially, like, even in my master's, like, I'm constantly, like, I was constantly trying to, like, schedule myself in, like, hey, I went from class to this to work to, like I said, yoga class or whatever. And so I think that this, like, almost forced situation of, like, I had no choice but to stop doing a lot of the things I was doing. Like, I couldn't go out and see people. I couldn't make those, like, meetings and stuff happen. I think that's really shown me a shift in, like, what it means to be productive and how productivity can look other than what I'm used to.
When was the moment you realized the need for self-compassion?
I could dole out so much advice to my friends who are stressed about a paper, a test, whatever it was. But I could never practice that with myself. And I think I really distinctly remember this one night. I was outside of a library with one of my best friends, and I was like, kind of felt like I was like on like the edge of like kind of not being so good. And I remember her like saying to me like, what if it was me in this situation? Like, what would you be saying to me, and why are you saying it to yourself? And I remember that being so clear of like, that's so true. Like, I would never hold anyone else to the same standard that I hold myself, because it really isn't reasonable. And I think that's kind of when I realized that there's so much more than just like what my grades are. There's so much more than like the comments on a paper. And while those things sound really small, like to me that they were like the biggest things that I was dealing with a lot of the time as a student especially. And so I've definitely learned with time so many skills of how to practice that self-compassion and holding myself to a standard more like how I would hold my friends, you know, and what I'd expect from them and what I wouldn't expect from them, right? So yeah, I think that was probably a really big shift, and I was definitely not perfect overnight. I still spent the next 2 years stressing a ton in undergrad, but I think also like taking that year off from school and realizing that like my world isn't just school, and I don't just have to be a student, I don't just have to be smart. You know, there's more to the world. There's stuff that I can do that isn't just writing papers. So I think that shift really has been helpful, especially my master's, where I'm like, I'm here to learn. I'm not here to be perfect. I'm here to make mistakes, and I've made so many mistakes. And I've written things in papers that have been not the best. And being like called in by my professors and being like, hey, think about how you just wrote that, and like, how could that be harmful? And things like that. So I think that shift has really been like, I'm here to learn and not to be perfect. And I think that's definitely a way of practicing self-compassion too, is like removing that standard from my expectations of myself.
That's a huge way that, you know, you're engaging with it, right? Would you say that's kind of like a framework within self-compassion for you?
Yeah, I think like that like kind of encaptures like what I was saying before about like that rest doesn't mean I'm being unproductive, you know? And I think it kind of like overall it's like I just need to be less hard on myself. And like whether that's in terms of like how I treat my body to how I treat my brain, you know, to like how I am around my friends, how I am at work. Like I'm not built to be like a machine. I'm not meant to be indestructible. Like I'm a human. I can make mistakes and stuff. And I think that trying to accept that with myself and like having those like conversations with myself, like it's okay if I make this mistake, it's okay if I'm not perfect, because what is perfect anyway, you know? So
powerful. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
How is your identity, whatever part you're thinking of, impacted self-compassion the most? And that could be your gender, that could be your age, that could be your ethnicity.
I guess in terms of my age, I've always been really mature, and I think that's something I actually really struggled with in undergrad. Even is like, I felt like I grew up a lot in high school, and like by the time I was in grade 12, I was like, okay, I'm ready for like real life kind of thing. And I think I always put a lot of my pressure on myself not to necessarily be like that wild fun person, but to always be like the mature one and stuff. And I think I spent a lot of time in my undergrad really trying to break that down. And I still do. But yeah, I've always been someone who like wants to take care of people. Like I always want to fix situations, like whether it's in my parents' relationship or like my brother's mental health or like issues in my extended family. Like it's always like I want to put pieces back together, and like I never took that like that point of view or that like that stance that like I can just be like not involved. Like I don't have to be the mature one that fixes the situation, that knows everything, because I'm not an expert. I don't know everything. And that's also been a really big piece of learning, I think. And I guess that could tie into self-compassion too, is that like I'm not an expert in anyone else's life than my own. I can't make claims about anything else. I'll never understand what someone else is feeling and going through. I can only understand what I am, even if I don't feel like I understand what I'm going through or thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But I think another really important part to discuss is the privilege that comes with being white and what it means for me to, I guess I read something recently that said privilege is not what you've experienced, but what you haven't had to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for me, that like really resonated. And like, I've been doing a lot of work in terms of unpacking and like figuring out different like tangible ways of breaking down my white privilege and doing what I can to dismantle and give it up, if that makes sense. So we do a lot of that work in my program, because our program's an anti-oppressive, anti-racist critical program in social work. So it's not clinical at all. It really challenges that clinical notion of social work as being like agents of the state, and it's a whole nother history that we can unpack. Mm-hmm. But I think really understanding like what groups of people I work with and why I work with them, and then who I am in that. Because to a lot of people in my role, I'm the epitome of what a threatening person looks like, because I'm a white social worker. And historically, white social workers are people who steal Indigenous children from their homes and who are part of upholding really, really harmful structures that we still maintain today. And so I think that really big piece for me is understanding that I don't have to just sit in who I am. I can be part of taking that apart and breaking that down, and whether that's spreading the money that I'm privileged enough to have around to different organizations and into community, to the work that I do every day, and that I'm critically reflecting on how I speak, how I present myself, how I do the work that I do, and what it means every single day to be anti-oppressive. How can I make this horrible system a little bit less crappy?
How do you think colonialism has impacted the way you understand and operate within self-compassion?
Right. Loaded question. We could probably
yes,
write a
it
thesis dissertation on this, but my existence isn't in a vacuum. It's built on a very long history of being part of an incredibly harmful system. And I think that in its entirety, the family history has shaped how I view not only myself, but how I practice self-compassion, and how my family practices self-compassion, and what that looks like, and how that is maybe stereotyped, and that piece that we've talked about too with like work ethic and productivity. And if we think about that expectation, that societal expectation, that if you are a contributing member of society, then you have a job, you own property, you pay taxes, you do all the things that uphold the colonial system and the structures that we function within. And so I think like back to like both my parents do all those things. They own property, they pay taxes, they have jobs, right? So and then for me, like I'm a direct product of that, and I grew up upholding that exact same thing, right? Until the last like several years, it wasn't until then that I started to recognize the fact that, like truly recognize how I'm complicit in upholding a system that was directly built to kill people. And so I think that's a really big piece for me, is recognizing that I don't exist in this alone, and that I need to be part of recognizing that history, and then going forward to have and build a different future, not just for myself, but for anyone that I work alongside or with, or even how I contribute to society more broadly, and how I support and advocate for and am an ally to people who don't meet that normative colonial mold of like that like Protestant work ethic of like I have to work hard to pay bills to contribute to society, right? And if I don't do that, then I'm viewed by society as someone who doesn't belong and who doesn't matter. And I entirely resist and reject that entire narrative. And if there's anything that I want to do is to challenge that in the work that I do moving forward, and whether it's in school, whether it's out in the world as an advocate or as an activist, whatever that is, I think that it all is built on colonialism, and I can't ever let that piece go. And recognize that as a reality in order to be able to break it down, because, yeah.
And how do we break it down in relation to self-compassion?
I think a really big piece of learning for me actually came from Audre Lorde. So we read one of her essays in my anti-racist practice class this year. And one of the things that she said is, it was an essay on anger, and but one thing she talked about was guilt. And I know that people talk about white guilt a lot, and how it's like for example, someone I know will say, well, it's not my fault that I'm white, I shouldn't have to be responsible for fixing things I didn't do. And that's an incredibly problematic stance to have, because there are people in this world who also aren't responsible for the positions that they're in, but it's a system that white supremacists, colonialists built. And so why should they have to bear the brunt of colonialism and we shouldn't, as white people? And so my piece with that is this thing around white guilt of like, oh, I feel bad that I'm white, I'm helpless, there's nothing I can do, I'm one small person. No, I entirely reject that statement and that way of thinking, because once you recognize it and you recognize that guilt is useless, it doesn't do anything, it doesn't fix anything, and to challenge that and to channel it into a different way of thinking and into, okay, that's my power then. Like my ability to create change and to advocate for change and be an ally in change, whatever avenue you identify with or that is necessary at that point, that's identified by whatever community you are supporting. The piece that Audre Lorde says, in addition to the piece around guilt being useless, is channel it into anger. And there's nothing wrong with anger. And we shouldn't expect people, like, everything to be about love, because anger is what brings change. And just as we're seeing now, it's a perfect example, right? With the movement that's happening really across the world at this point, in terms of Black Lives Matter. And so, yeah, I think that that's a really big piece for me in terms of like how colonialism relates to my self-compassion, is that I don't let myself sit in that quote unquote white guilt. I do what I can to challenge that. And sure, I'll have moments of like, man, I wish that this wasn't the way things were, of course, but
no, but you know, we just, that unpacking that like that's a lot. That's very heavy. And you know, I feel like I'm witnessing you go through that and also understand how self-compassion comes up in your own social justice work. And as a settler, as a person, like you said, who was not invited to these lands, who is occupying these lands, it's powerful.
Again, like, it didn't happen overnight. My work isn't done with recognizing and breaking down my white privilege. I've only just started to scratch the surface of what that means. And I know that I fumble, I make mistakes, I'm going to continue to, and I think that it would be more harmful for me to shut down with that than for me to recognize the fact that, okay, I've made a mistake, which again is like something I'm working on with self-compassion, is like letting myself screw up, you know? Because if I don't, then I'm not doing anything, right?
So Sam, let's break it down a little more and talk about the patriarchy. And what I'm curious to know is how gender norms and gender regulations and expectations have impacted the way you understand as well as practice self-compassion.
Yeah, I think a big piece of that is the stereotype that of women as emotional, as quote unquote hysterical. Part of that piece too, with the pressure that I put on myself, I think a lot of it has always been to be tough and to be strong and to not be identified as that stereotype. I've always wanted to be that like strong, independent woman, and like I think I do a lot of the things that I do subconsciously because of that. always hid how I was feeling. Like my one best friend was the only one that ever knew what was going on. Like it was always like a really like private thing, and it was really heavily encouraged by my family to keep it private. Like my mom is like super like, nobody else knows our issues, like you keep it to yourself, like you don't tell anyone, because there's almost that like piece of like embarrassment if like we weren't the perfect family, if we weren't like that like 2 parents heteronormative households with the 2 kids, the dog, the cat, you know, like if we broke that mold, that was something that she feared. And so I did a lot of keeping my feelings secret, and I think that getting into university and like breaking free of that, like my mom's not always watching me, she doesn't know what I'm doing, and I can go to therapy and no one can judge me because I can walk myself there and stuff. And that's something that I'm like really constantly checking in with, and I think that it was always at least rooted in the fact that I never wanted to come across as like that emotional woman or girl. And I think that taking that a step further and going a step deeper is that idea of like, what does it mean to be that emotional girl? Like, why is emotion viewed as a weakness? And like, why do I have to turn that off? And like, why can't that exist? And yeah, I think that really comes down to that idea of like, I wanted to, in a sense, challenge one norm, but in doing so, I upheld another. So like, I wanted to challenge that idea that I wasn't a weak or emotional woman, but that I also then inherently upheld that like notion of like mental health isn't something that we talk about, if that makes sense.
It's interesting that you make that connection.
Right? Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that a little more?
Yeah, I think this is like probably one of the first time I've even like really like even made that connection, right? Like that piece of like holding, I guess, like that reality of like my dad, I've seen him cry like maybe a handful of times, and like maybe that's who he is as a person, but I also know that like he has that ingrained in him to like be the strong like quote unquote head of household. Like I literally grew up in like the stereotypical white heteronormative family, and my family's like subconsciously worked to maintain that with me, you know, like to make sure that I grew up that same way that they did, that I had that good, strong family. I had every opportunity that I could have had. And I upheld that for a really long time. And I think that maybe that other little piece of justice that I do is by saying like, yep, I go to therapy. Yep, I take pills for anxiety because sometimes it's not manageable. And I think keeping that a secret, even like earlier, I was like, oh, I'll talk about therapy, but I won't talk about the medication. But that's me upholding that notion that there's something wrong with me if I'm doing that when there's not.
Wow.
Right? And like even in the span of this hour of talking together with like one of my closest friends, I can still feel hesitant about that, because how am I going to be portrayed? What stereotypes are now going to be applied to me, even though I'm a straight A student and I'm a social worker and I'm all these things? How am I going to be viewed because of my mental health? Which is really good right now because I'm taking those steps and I'm doing those things that break down those norms. And I think, like I said, like a lot of that is really rooted in those gender norms and stereotypes, and that like balance of like, okay, what do I break down, but like what do I uphold, and like wrestling with that, I think.
And it sounds like there's a lot of self-compassion within that. Your ability to unlearn, but take that gracious amount of space between, you know, I'm not like some woman who's emotional or hysteric, like I'm a strong woman, and you're taking that ownership. And that within itself, would you say for you, is that self-compassion? Yeah.
And I think actually that other piece that I want to touch on, that like my self-compassion isn't solely inward and centered around me, but it's also how I practice compassion for others. And so I think that, for example, like I could spend time being upset that I was raised the way that I was. But again, when you take that step deeper, how were my parents conditioned to think? How was my mom conditioned to think about mental health? Was she ever asked, like, how's your mental health? No.
And then how that affects you.
Exactly.
It trickles down.
Exactly. And like, even like you, I think it was a few weeks ago, you're like, how's your mental health? I was like, nobody says that. Like, nobody like straight up will just like ask that.
And the idea that something needs to be fixed. I think it's sometimes that there just needs to be an acceptance. We're human. We're going through a lot of different emotions. They're not who we are, but they're an experience. And there needs to be acceptance. It's not always about fixing the problem. And we're quick. I think that kind of comes with a productivity and that capitalistic perspective of fixing things. And it's never the deeper introspective, like reflexive work that you clearly have been doing. You do it in your work. You do it in your daily practice. You're doing it right now. As I'm talking, you're probably analyzing what you're thinking. How do you think the gender binary that you grew up with has impacted the way you understand self-compassion?
I was always taught like, oh, like if a boy throws rocks at you, it just means that he likes you, which is becoming more of a narrative now around like, so what's that teaching kids? That violence means love, and that it's okay for someone to hurt you as long as they tell you that they like you after, or that they love you, or that they care about you. Unpacking that and like realizing like I didn't show myself self-compassion in so many instances where people hurt me because I was conditioned to think that that's what a relationship is, and then as long as they go to fix it, then it's okay. And it's not. And it's taken a really long time to learn that and to understand that, and I think that my self-compassion in terms of that has really shifted, because like before I let myself be a victim of that, and now I understand what I'm worth and what I deserve, and I think that that's me being kind to myself and not letting myself be hurt because it is what I was taught to accept.
I just like how you really reclaimed that for yourself. To end this session, I have one last question. How has your view of self-compassion changed?
I don't think I realized like how deeply connected self-compassion is to so many different factors of my life. It is so, I think that even this piece of like how vulnerable I've been, like I didn't come into it thinking like, oh, I'll be really open and stuff. But I think that I don't want to walk away from this thinking I've put something out there that wasn't genuine and wasn't authentic and wasn't real. And I think that too is a piece of being compassionate with myself and saying like, I want to do something that feels good. I want to do something that maybe something I'll say will sit with someone, you know?
And just exploring your truth.
Yeah. And like, and making those connections, like so many things, like tying like how I was conditioned from the time I was little to like how I let myself be in different relationships, to how I can tie like my work into it, and just like from school and how it's shifted over time and stuff. I don't think that I've ever like sat down and really thought about that. And so I'm definitely appreciative of like how you've like kind of guided through this, and I think that it's been really interesting to see like how I've tied all those things together, especially like with mental health to like just everything.
It's been fantastic to have you here. Like you said, you've been really authentic, and like I've already said, the vulnerability piece that you brought today was really important, and I thank you for sitting through some tough conversations and just being open.
Yeah, I think it's important to have the tough conversations, because if we don't have it, then how are things going to change, you know? Yeah. My self-compassion after will be a drink with some friends, so yeah,
there we go. Thank you so much for being here and sharing the space with me and just fully engaging with the questions I had. I know I learned a lot, and I'm glad that you are walking away with some good, and you know, we got to be reflexive today. So that's it for this episode. Thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you all gained something today, and if not, that's cool too. Keep tuning in. We'll be here next week again, having more conversations around self-compassion. See you next week.